Well, a couple weeks ago I did a video about the world reaching peak GDP sometime over the next 20 years, or perhaps even sooner, like now. Well, one of the big reasons is that China loses 300 million workers over the next 20 years. And this is something you don't hear the Chinese media talking about, although they should be, and they should be planning for it. And because this is one of the biggest population crisis, if not the biggest population crisis in human history, that's not caused by mass deaths. Because what's going to happen is China has had a decline in their fertility rate for a long time. And so they reached a peak in their birth rates in the 1960s, where they had 153 million people born over a 5-year period who are still alive based on UN statistics. And all these statistics come from the UN here, and then modifications I'll discuss. So from 60 to 65, there's 136.4 million people that are getting near the 60-year retirement age in China, and it's 55 for women, so some are already retiring, and of course some may have retired early. And then 65 to 70, 153 million. So you're looking at 190 million Chinese retiring this decade, officially. Of course, some of them will end up continuing to work in some form or another. Some may have to make ends meet. Some may do it out of choice. But what we're looking at is those people being replaced by 20-year-olds that are getting out of high school or college, and I use 20 to kind of split the difference between high school and college, in order to determine how many they're replaced with. So 136.4 million are replaced by 85.7 million, who are going to be turning 20 and entering the workforce as people turning 60s start retirement. So in the next 5 years, you're going to see 50.7 million fewer people in the workforce. So over 10 million a year based on UN statistics alone. And then the following few years, it's 66.8 million, because the number of people entering the workforce based on the UN numbers, the birth rates have been fairly stable the last 20 years. So, and then after that, you have 140 million over a 5-year period, and then 108 million. There was a dip. That was the first part of the dip when the one-child policy came into effect, starting in 79 and 80. So you started to see a drop there. Now, in total, that's 537.9 million people retiring over the next 20 years, being replaced by 345. That's 192.7. And then if you add the 350,000 net emigration that China's had over the last 10 years or so, that you can round that up to 200 million. But that's not the end of the story, because China has been fudging these numbers for a long time. If you look at China's fertility rate statistics over the last 20, 30 years, they've been saying their fertility rate's 1.6 or 1.7, even though they're under a one-child policy, which means it should be less than 1 if people are following the law. So China has been saying that over half the women are breaking the one-child policy law and getting into trouble and paying fines accordingly. But if you look at the culture, you don't see 50% of the families having 2 children. That's a falsification of the data. And many professionals, and most notably Yifu Zhang, have been looking at statistics, trying to determine what the real numbers are. And the real fertility rate appears to be in the 1.05 to 1.2 range, possibly 1.3 at a maximum in any given year. And an analysis done based on the 2010 census showed that in the largest cities, the fertility rate ranges from about 0.8 in Beijing up to 0.9 in some of the other cities, while in the rural areas it can be 1.4 to 1.5. And so on average it's going to be at 1.2 to 1.3 based on those rough statistics, and that's in 2010. So China's been lying about the population a long time. And Dr. E has one specific example he's discussed, and that's the year 2000. In the year 2000, he estimated there were 13 million births. The Chinese government said 18 million. But by 2005, that number had been reduced to 15 million 5-year-olds. And by 2010, there were 13 million 10-year-olds. So China was adjusting the numbers as we went. And no, while their child death rates are higher than some countries, they're not that high. They're not losing a huge percentage of their children each year dying to various causes. Although I didn't mention back in 1960, 61, early part of 62 was part of the Great Leap Forward, or Great Leap Backward if you prefer, where millions of Chinese died. So there are actually fewer people that have been retiring last year and this year than would have happened if it wasn't for Mao Zedong killing millions of his people. And because of that, the replacement rate's been okay. But starting next year, 2022, and then 2023, that's when they fall off the cliff demographically. But if you take the number of 2008, the Chinese government was lying by 5 million births. And if you assume they average 5 million births worth of lies, which makes sense if you look at if the real rate, fertility rate's 1.2 and they've been saying 1.7, then yeah, they're adding on more than 5 million births a year to their statistics. Well, that brings this number up to 292.7, which brings it up to 300 when you include immigration. So China looks like they're going to lose 300 million workers over the next 20 years, which is going to have a massive effect on the Chinese economy because their total number of workforce age people is only about 900 million now. So you're looking at it dropping from 900 million to 600 million. So, and it's even worse if you go out 10 more years, they're going to lose another 150 million. So they're going to use 170 million this decade, 130 million the following decade, and then 2041 to 2050, another 150 million plus. That's assuming there are around 10 million children born each year from now over the next decade. And the 10 million number that China initially put out before they fudged it to 12 million, the 10 million number is probably closer to accurate, although it could actually be closer to 9 million, once again according to Yifu-Zhen's estimate. So they're going to lose 450 million people over the next 30 years, basically cutting their eligible workforce in half. And you can compare that to the U.S., which right now there's around 150 million employed workers in the U.S. So China is going to lose the equivalent of the entire U.S. workforce each decade over the next 3 decades. And this is going to be made worse by a couple other factors. China is going through a problem the U.S. went through starting in the 50s, 60s, 70s, where as more and more children attended college, they wanted white-collar jobs, and they didn't want to work in a blue-collar factory where their dad worked or their granddad worked. And the blue-collar factories couldn't find employees and started to close, and they moved their business to other countries, like China, to find workers. So China is in that place where they have around 9 million college grads each year looking for a job, and there's not enough white-collar jobs to go around. So those students and recent college graduates are having to take jobs that are below their education level, or they're unemployed. And then we have unfilled blue-collar jobs because of that. There aren't enough workers to fill the vacancies in blue-collar businesses, in manufacturing. So the manufacturing sector is getting a shortage of employees. And ultimately, they're going to have to move the low-end blue-collar manufacturing into other countries where there are workers that can work for less money and are willing to work in the blue-collar factory jobs. So this transition is going to be very problematic. And it'll be interesting to see if China at all can transition into a white-collar jobs and ultimately into a high-income bracket country, which they might be able to do. If you get rid of half your workforce, they may end up migrating into a high-income country over the next 30 years. But we'll see. We'll see about that. There's also the lying flat movement versus 996. A lot of the companies, when they hire people, they expect them to work from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week. So they're working long hours, long hard hours, and some newer college grads are not going to do that. They've realized that that's no way to live. And it is no way to live. And when I was younger in Austin, there was a movie called Slackers, where people didn't want to live that way. They wanted to just make enough money to get by, enough money to have a few drinks with their buds and eat and have a cheap apartment. And they're cool with that. They live a good life, and they're not a slave to some billionaire employer or government. And so that movement will probably grow as it has in the US and Europe as people realize that their standard of life, their actual living life, isn't work. Work isn't life. You live the rest of the time when you're at home with your friends and your family and taking vacations and holidays. Being behind a desk for 12 hours a day isn't life. And then there's also age discrimination. If you listen to some of the business strategies, they realize that people over 35 don't want to do the 996 job, so they start cutting people loose. So they fire people over 35 to make room for the recent college grads that are desperate enough to take the job and not smart enough to realize that their future shouldn't be as a slave to an employer working 12-hour days. But this is a bigger issue of age discrimination, that older people above 35 or 45 are going to find difficulty finding new jobs and good paying jobs. And even though in order to keep up the workforce, China is going to have to keep older people working. But on the other hand, it's too late to raise the retirement age without having 500 million people being pissed off at the government. And these people have a lot of power, and also these people are connected within the CCP, within the Chinese government. So it's going to be extremely difficult to raise the retirement age. China should have raised the retirement age 20 years ago and had it phased in, where it would go from 60 to 65 to 67 to 70 even, maybe. They should have done that 20 years ago. But now it's going to be highly problematic. They can encourage older people to work, maybe on a voluntary basis, but it's going to be very difficult for them to change the rules. So China's in a tough spot, losing. Most people, I don't think, are aware that it's 300 million people over the next 20 years and 170 million people over the next 10 years, possibly. It could be a little less, a little more, depending on what estimate you believe is the fudge factor the Chinese government's been using. But I wanted to do a video on this so that at least people who watch my video would be aware of what's going to happen and can prepare. Basically, if you're looking at when is the real estate bubble going to burst in China, well, it's got to burst. There's not enough people to buy the homes that have already been built, even less homes that are being built now. Those homes will never be occupied. No one will ever need to use the homes or the infrastructure. So it's probably a good time to get out of real estate over the next few years. Maybe get out of the country entirely. As far as immigration goes, China did have healthy immigration of 800,000 to 1 million people a year. But even that has dropped now because of the way the Chinese government's acting. And more people are trying to leave China, especially those in Hong Kong. So this number of a net immigration of 350,000 may balloon up until the point that the CCP decides that they're going to put a stop to it and prevent people from leaving. So once again, if you have the ability to leave and retire early and have enough funds put away, now might be a good time to leave China anyway. Well, I hope you enjoy the video, and I hope you put some thought into it. And please like it and share it with people, anyone you think that might be interested in knowing this. And this is based on UN statistics. Even if you believe the UN statistics, that's 200 million people over 10 years. So like it, share it, subscribe for my other videos. I promise I'll get back to doing more physics videos. And I'll look forward to you watching next time. Thanks.